Okay, great. So thanks everyone for joining. Today we have a seminar from James Mckay from the University of Leeds. James is an artist, a science illustrator and UNRISK CTD manager, and is going to be talking to you about visual communication of research. So we'll have the talk first, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So please save some to ask what you're curious about. So with that, I'll hand over to James. Take it away.
Thank you, Ellie. Can you see the slides okay? Great, okay. Thank you, Ellie, for inviting me to this talk. Hopefully this will be something interesting for everybody. So I'm going to talk about visual communication of research. So my work is all about illustration and 2D visuals. There's no reason why you can't do visual communication in other ways, for example, through films or sculpture or craft or anything. But as I say, that's my genre. So I'll give a talk about that. So I'm just going to talk about me for a couple of minutes, about reasons why you might want to engage, and how important visual communication is. And then I'm going to talk about some case studies of projects that I've been involved in, that give various insights into what it's like to work with visuals and what you can expect. So some of that is to do with paleoclimate, some of it's to do with future scenarios. The Dreams of a Low Carbon Future projects are to do with communicating to children about the transition to a net zero future. And I'm going to talk about shared socioeconomic pathways and comparing different scenarios through art. Then at the end of that, there'll be time for some Q&A, as Ellie said. I should just go back to the initial slide. As I was just talking to Ellie, this is a picture of Pliocene Greenland. So Greenland about 3 million years ago, when there were horses and camels and giant beavers running around. So this is a piece of artwork I was commissioned to do at the University of Leeds. So a little bit about me. I did an art degree, but interestingly, it was labeled visual communication design. So that's pretty much what I'm talking about in this talk. So I'm happy that that's kind of continued. As Elliot said, I'm also the manager of the UNRISK Centre for Doctoral Training at the University of Leeds. So my art kind of sits alongside that. I do some projects within the Centres for Doctoral Training and within the university, and some projects outside. So during the 2000s, after I did my degree, I worked a lot in comics. I did some work for 2000 AD, which is a well-known science fiction magazine. And through that, I learned a lot about storytelling. So comics are a really tough genre to work in, or medium to work in, and you have to be really good at storytelling. Everything has to tell a story, and no matter how good the artwork is, if it doesn't work for what you're trying to communicate, then you have to ditch it. You have to be really ruthless. So that was a really good learning experience. And then for the next sort of 10 years or so, I did a lot of projects with PhD students in our Centres for Doctoral Training at Leeds in engineering, which is all about the transition to a low carbon future. So we were imagining future worlds, and those got shortlisted for various awards, including the Engaging Young People Award. So that was a whole series of different projects, mainly funded by the Royal Academy of Engineering. And then just recently, I've won an award for doing paleo art, which is kind of where I started off. So I've always been interested in ancient life and ancient environments, and I'm continuing to do that. And I've produced a lot of books and scientific papers where I've communicated research about the ancient world. So there's reasons for doing different types of engagement, and visuals may be really important in some areas and not so important in others. But I just kind of run through why you might want to engage with people and what they're looking for. So in the work for the CDT that I manage, all of our partners constantly tell us that the main skill that they want to see from graduates is the ability to rapidly synthesize a lot of information and communicate it really quickly and efficiently. So that's a really important skill that might land you a great career. And it's often hard to teach that. There are lots of individual courses you can do in particular areas about, how to do PowerPoint presentations, or, how to write well. But it's often not really brought together. So yeah, that's a lot of what our employers tell us. And again, with research funders and the research community, being able to communicate really clearly, especially to people who are not in your subject area, could be really critical for making interdisciplinary connections or gaining extra funding for your projects and generally promoting yourself. And then within the media, you can have a huge impact and wide dissemination, a global dissemination, and really kind of drive the popular knowledge of your subject. And obviously the media thrives on visuals. I've lost out in a couple of competitions and awards where I was submitting still images, whereas I was up against people who had films and cartoons that moved, and those always sort of capture people's attention. And then policymakers, obviously you can have huge impact from your research with policymakers, and they're very busy people, obviously. And again, like employers, they want the most rapid summation of your ideas and your topics as possible. So that's a really good skill. And then for inspiring the next generation, which was a key driver behind some of the projects I've done, you have to become really good at communicating to and inspiring people, getting them enthusiastic about your research area, which is difficult. Some people have got a natural knack for it. I worked with a PhD student who used to work at a zoo, and he was amazing at talking to young children. So he just had that knack. But you can learn that through doing things, and I organise a lot of engagement activities where our PhD students go off and do engagement activities with children. And then finally, communities. I'm involved with quite a few community projects, and visuals there coming out of research or coming out of the community's activities can really inspire people and encourage activism and people to protect important assets in the community. So all of those things are important for engagement, and visuals can be really inspiring and really eye-catching for helping with that. So I'll just start with a couple of different images that convey a couple of ideas. So this is a very complicated image that I was asked to do as a poster for a national network to do with fresh water. And there's lots going on, there's lots of projects. It's a very complicated image. But really, this was just a pretty picture that they wanted to promote the consortium. There wasn't one particular reason why they needed it. And so it doesn't actually particularly work for a particular project. It's not conveying anything other than there are various issues going on that are well known within rivers. Whereas this next image, which was an image I worked on with researchers at University of Leeds, was a real hard-working image that came out of a specific project. And this is the kind of thing that I'm most interested in. So it's a project where they're doing using sensors to gauge the temperature of glaciers in the Himalayas. This is the Khumbu Glacier near Mount Everest, and finding out that actually some of them are on the point of collapse because they're very warm, quite deep down into the glacier, almost at the contact point with the ground. But the interesting thing about this image was that the main reason for producing it would be to communicate with the communities who live around the mountains, and are part of the project. So they're helping with the logistics for the projects, or they're being affected, or the scientists have to communicate with those people as part of the outputs of the project. And so this image came from understanding what the scientists wanted to convey to those people, and it's been all over the Himalayas with their project, talking to the villagers and places in really remote areas, to help them understand what's going on. So I'll start off with my paleo artwork, which comes from lots of different researchers in ancient environments. So here you can see me in a studio developing some sketches based on a lot of different scientific papers that I've been given. And so some of my common images are reconstructing prehistoric animals. So this was a project I did with a scientist called Dean Lomax, who just discovered a new species of ichthyosaur. And this was promoting the discovery and the scientific papers that he was producing. This is another piece of paleo art for an early career researcher who was looking at an ancient environment in the Jurassic, and analysing all the different ecologies of the animals that were present. So they wanted an overview of the whole environment. This was really interesting again, because it was translating quite complex data and charts about teeth morphology and likely diets of different animals, and placing them in the environment where they could have been and where they might have been predating on each other. So it was conveying a huge amount of information in a single image. And there were other images that were overlaid on top of this. So this picture is my main sort of case study in this kind of area. So I had an email from a group who were on a research ship in the Antarctic, and they contacted me and said, hey, we've just discovered a fossil forest. We're on a research ship and we've just made a core into the seabed and found loads of fossil pollen, bits of wood in the core. And so it's one of the sites that was probably the closest site to the South Pole during the Mesozoic that we've ever found. So they wanted me to create an image for the paper that was going to announce this discovery. But the interesting thing about this project was that my artwork actually influenced the thinking of the scientists involved in the project. So when they asked me to do a sketch for it, my sketch that would pull together all of the different data that I was given about pollen and different species of trees actually caused a big argument among the scientists. So some of them said that it captured it exactly how they'd imagined it, and then others were saying that it was very different to that, and that it ought to be much more open, or kind of more like tundra. And so the image itself triggered lots of emails firing off between different groups, and perhaps led to maybe a different outcome for the paper than would otherwise have happened. So I was really pleased that that process worked in that way, and eventually the differences were kind of resolved, and then I produced this final image, which did a lot of work in the media for it, and as a career highlight I got on the cover of Nature magazine. So that was really great. The only problem was it came out about a week after the lockdown for COVID, so I had very little opportunity to promote it at that point. So this is another piece of artwork that summarized a huge amount of research by a team of scientists at the University of Leeds. working on a climate event in the Jurassic on the Yorkshire coast. So there was a major period of global warming and a mass extinction event. And what they wanted was to convey the food webs that were going on and the effect that the mass extinction event had on those food webs. So although it's a picture, it's almost like a, a chart or a pie chart, or some kind of other visual that conveys a lot of different information about what the organisms are doing in different places in their environment. So there's all kinds of things you can see in this environment, where there are things burrowing into the seabed, there's things feeding on the seabed, there's things swimming around higher up in the water column. So all of these had to be researched and put together by the scientists and advising me. And then here you can see the effect of the mass extinction. All of the life on the seabed has disappeared apart from one species of shell. And there's nothing going on in the seabed because of the anoxic conditions that killed everything in the seabed. And then here we have a bit of a recovery. And then the final image is the late recovery period, which took about 7 million years. And we're back to having lots of things going into the seabed, lots of different organisms there. But the interesting thing for the paper was that the organisms that are present in the final image are very different to the ones in the first image. So there's lots of new species, lots of new food webs going on. So there's a big revolution in terms of what's happening in these particular seas. So this was conveying a huge amount of work done by the team. And literally every shell we had to try and communicate exactly where it stood. So I became very knowledgeable about whether a shell is supposed to be sitting half buried in the sediment, or if it's down deep, or if there's a burrow next to it, and that kind of thing. But really interesting from the point of view of what the art can convey, as opposed to the quite dry diagrams that the scientists had. This is the image that just won me the award that I mentioned at the beginning. So this is a fossil called Thalassinoides, which is a burrow fossil. So shrimps were burrowing into the seabed. And usually when you see mention of this in scientific papers, you see a very kind of flat 2D diagram of a burrow, which doesn't really convey much about the environment. So I wanted to do a 3D version of that for a book that I'd been commissioned to do. And I worked with the researchers to understand the structure, which was very difficult. And we actually went through lots of different versions of the picture before this final image. So I was very pleased that this one won an award, because it was really hard to work on, and the culmination of a lot of different people working together. This image is again working on paleo environments, so it's just after the end of the Ice Age, when there's a famous archaeological site called Star Car in Yorkshire, which is the first place that humans came to after the Ice Age. And again, it's conveying a huge amount of information from the archaeological discoveries. So even things like the plank of wood that you can see at the bottom that's resting on the water, it's like a walkway, has been discovered. So everything in there is things that were being conveyed by the research. So going on to climate futures, I worked on a paper with a group of scientists who were projecting global temperatures out to 2500 and trying to work out how the food systems would work in the future, and where we would be able to grow staple crops. So for the paper, they wanted a picture of particular places. So the first place was Kansas in the US, and they wanted it in the past, in the present, and then showing the future version. So you can see the past version at the bottom here, where there's Native American groups who are farming in a diverse and sustainable way on the plains of Kansas. And then we go on to the present day, where there are monocultures of cereal crops, which are the breadbasket for a large part of the world's food supply. And then, really interestingly, the scientists in the paper wanted me to create basically sci-fi images of what might happen in the future. So although it's science fiction, they wanted that to communicate particular ideas. So the idea is that in their modeling, the area of Kansas in the US would become extremely wet and extremely tropical, so really high temperatures. So perhaps a bit more like somewhere like Indonesia, with strange sort of palm oil type plants that might have been genetically engineered. So throughout this paper, we freely speculated about what might be happening in 2500. It's impossible to know, obviously, or even predict to any degree, but through using science fiction, it communicated things that the scientists wanted to get across to the public, and this was taken up globally and made a huge impact. This is another picture. So this is the Amazon. Again, this is in 1500 AD, and then in the present, and then out to 2500 when it's become a sort of a desert-like environment. So that's the sort of first section of the talk about the paleoclimate and future climate pictures that I've done. So I'll move on now to talking about A Dream of a Low Carbon Future, which is a series of projects that I did where it involved creating graphic novels and comics about children's visions of the future. So they were funded by the Royal Academy of Engineering, and we held hundreds of workshops with artists, scientists, school children, and the PhD researchers who were involved in the project. And those developed lots of artwork, which the children did throughout the project. So things like this, where they came up with their own designs of strange renewable machinery or renewable energy production, or something to do with sustainability, or gloomy ideas about what might happen, or different ideas comparing bad and good, and some really funny ones as well. So the whole aim of the project was to get children to think about engineering and problem solving and science and get inspired by that. But the output would be a comic which explored different sorts of futures that we could use to communicate really important ideas about engineering research. So we came out of the first project in 2014 with a comic that showed lots of different visions of the future, but I wanted to focus more on a positive vision of the future. So we realized that dystopia, which is the bad future, is a kind of a lazy future, because it's almost like we don't really need to imagine that, because we can see that happening around today in countries that are ravaged by war or environmental disaster. We know what that looks like. Whereas a good future requires a very different mindset. We need imagination, creativity, and problem solving. And there's lots of different people's visions. So we moved into creating work that communicated research about positive solutions to climate change. One of the main pictures that I produced with the scientists and artists on this project was this one, which showed a community that's living in a sustainable way, and every part of the picture was used to communicate something about climate change solutions. And this went global and has been used by lots of different groups all around the world for websites and posters and book covers. So it's been really successful. There's a couple here. So I worked on the book on the left, which I'll show you some more of in a minute. And yeah, some typical book covers elsewhere. So this has all come out of the PhD research within the Centres for Doctoral Training at Leeds and a few other students elsewhere. So within that book, Unlocking Sustainable Futures, I developed more artwork with the researchers who were working on that to convey different aspects of the positive future that they were working on. So things like renewable energy and car-free cities. And so these pictures have again been taken up in a lot of areas and have been part of exhibitions. So interestingly, a further project that I worked on with some of those same researchers was a book where we ended up creating very simple artworks. So obviously it's nice if you can create a beautiful full color painting of something that might communicate some part of research, but not everyone can do that. And sometimes it's not necessary. So as I worked on this project, the artwork became simpler and simpler until it was just stick figures talking to each other. And that was really effective for what we were trying to convey in the project. And so it's definitely a kind of a point to make that you don't have to do amazing artwork to be able to communicate well. But having said that, my background in comics helped me to, even though it's very simple, there's some quite sort of a lot of messing about going into placing exactly where people are speaking to get the most emphasis and that kind of thing. And composing even really simple pictures is quite tricky if you want to keep it simple. An interesting part of these projects was that we were asked to produce a graphic explainer, so a comic about bioenergy, which is a really controversial area. So there's lots of different opinions, and I led a team of 4 artists who worked with a big group of researchers from all over the country to create the content for the comic, which we then spent 6 months or so illustrating and then producing. And that was really successful. It's been translated into lots of different languages, and it's available on the website for the Supergen Bioenergy Hub. But the interesting thing about this was that during the workshops that we had with the artists and the scientists, where the artists were trying to understand the topic, there were lots of disagreements. And within the comic, we included those disagreements. So some of the people who are talking to each other are disagreeing with each other about the various terms and how people interpret the findings that we get from energy balances and greenhouse gas emissions and carbon debt and that kind of thing. So a visual communication doesn't have to be purely promoting your work. It can actually show a lot of nuance that you don't get through a chart. So yeah, that's an interesting thing to consider when you're thinking about visual communication. You don't have to be black and white. You can convey lots of shades of grey through different ways of producing art. And again, it doesn't have to be a 2D illustration. It can be an amazing soundscape or something, or listening to people talking. And the other thing I do through these projects is a lot of live art with communities. So I will go out to a particular community that are having a festival, for example, about community futures or sustainability, and then illustrate the visions that they've had for their community and show what that could look like, and making it interactive by having people feed their ideas into the picture while I'm working on it, and then producing a picture that's come together through lots of different people's suggestions. And my work was taken up by Rob Hopkins, who's the founder of the Transition Towns movement. And his big thesis fits in with the whole idea of visual communication, in that in relation to the transition to a sustainable future, he wants to ask, what if we manage to get there? So imagining the future as the best version that you could imagine, and then working backwards to see, what would be needed to get there. But that's the kind of idea that you can work on with some kind of visual collaboration with people, is that rather than trying to work through something from scratch, imagine the best case scenario. So imagine your research achieving everything that you want it to achieve. What would that look like, or how could you communicate that? And then maybe you know a bit more about what you might need to get there. But having that kind of inspiring idea at the front can really help. And as Rob Hopkins says, if we can't visualize the positive outcome, it's very hard to get there, and we often tend to left with the negative version as a result, as a default. And so one of the final things that's come out of these projects is a film that I've made with David Bunting, and it's been funded through various grants, and it's been released worldwide and has won lots of awards. And it's called No One is an Island, and it explores a transition to a sustainable future and the controversies around that through artwork, my artwork, and the artwork of children who helped with the project. So coming right out of the Dreams of a Low Carbon Future pictures. So it's a really amazing experience that I was able to work on this film. It's only 10 minutes long, so it's an animated short, but it took about 2 years to make, and involved lots of work with different researchers trying to communicate exactly what they wanted to say about their new findings, and working with the children. So you can Google that and have a look at the trailers of how we made it as well. And then moving on to the final bit, I'm going to talk about different scenarios. So I'm sure that most people involved in this talk will be familiar with socioeconomic pathways. So just to recap, these are different scenarios for climate that are used to help provide the basis for modeling various futures. And there are different types, but again, these do come across as kind of science fiction ideas, especially number 3, which is sort of a Mad Max vision of the world. So I get often asked by researchers who are modelers to produce images that convey their research into different versions of shared socioeconomic pathways, so different pathways. So here we have a picture of Leeds under different pathways. One is the middle of the road one, and one is the Mad Max kind of regional rivalry version. So big changes in how the future might pan out. So this one was about flooding and urban issues within Leeds, but it wasn't specifically about modelling particular geographical areas. Whereas this project was with the North York Moors National Park, and they worked with researchers at University of Leeds who were doing modelling on 1 kilometre grids of different changes in land use, depending on different shared socioeconomic pathways and RCP values. So looking at kind of a green future and business as usual, where things are not going so well, where we haven't really made any effort to solve climate problems. And so I had to work with the modelers in really great detail to understand the landscape and understand what their modeling was saying, and really forcing the modeling to come down to 1 kilometer grids where, that might intersect with a cliff or a hillside or streams, current streams or current farms. So it was really hard to actually come to those kind of clear decisions. But the research team were really interested in trying to make those visions happen. So here you can see some different versions of a particular place to give an idea of how the same place might look under different scenarios. So I just thought that it would be useful to explain how some of these visions came about and how some of this communication came about. So through working with the artists and the scientists and all the communities involved, we boiled down these workshops to really efficient kind of events where we wanted to get particular artwork from people that was communicating research. So this is something that you could do within other projects, your own project. So if you convene an event, you can explain some of the climate science, for example, for a few minutes, get people to ask questions about it, maybe have a bit of discussion, bit of interactivity, and then give about half an hour for people to create their own interpretation of the science or the desired outcome. So for our project, it was about trying to draw pictures of the place where people live in the future and their desired outcomes. Then after that, about half an hour of that, hold them up, discuss them, do a bit of show and tell. And that can often provide the basis for some really amazing pieces of artwork, and illustration and interpretation of science. So I'd really recommend that as an approach to an event, and something that you could do if you're interested in visual communication of your research. And there's plenty of opportunities to get involved in doing larger projects with larger collaborations through things like centres for doctoral training, flexible funds, and science festival type activities. So just to recap again, I've used my visual art here as a case study. So not everybody does full color paintings of ancient landscapes, but you can kind of see how some of the concepts and ideas might apply elsewhere, whether you're working with filmmakers or storytellers, artists who might work in sculpture or textiles. A lot of the issues are the same. And for me, the most interesting part of it is working with the scientists and actually getting to the core of what they want to communicate. And often it's not obvious to them at the start. So it's the act of trying to explain and cross those different worlds that actually makes you into a better communicator. So I think even if nothing comes out of it, the process of trying to explain your work to someone who's trying to interpret it in a very different way is really valuable. And just a little aside is that I'm always trying to promote the work of the PhD students in our own centres for doctoral training, and it's almost impossible to get them to provide a photograph of themselves doing something which we can use to promote them. And so if you don't do that and you don't choose something that people can use, then they'll do it for you. So it might not be something that you're particularly happy with. So just try and think about that. So the basic visual communication is to have some kind of something that promotes you and promotes your research that you're happy with, that you can use in lots of different places, as a kind of a calling card or um, an icon that you might use on a Teams meeting, that kind of thing. So I hope that that's been an interesting run through of some projects, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, James. That was a really interesting talk. So I think what we're going to do now is pause the recording, and then we can go to questions. If anybody has questions for James, if you could either put them in the chat, or you can also raise your hand, and then we'll go in order to pick some questions. So pause it now.